When William Murphy's wife finally decided to speak, the world listened, and then the church went silent. For years, they were the image of faith, love, and ministry perfection. But what she revealed has left everyone questioning everything they thought they knew about this gospel power couple. Stay tuned, because the truth behind their marriage is far deeper and far darker than anyone expected. For years, Pastor William Murphy and his wife were seen as the definition of a power couple in gospel music, a living example of love, faith, and endurance. Together, living example of love, faith, and endurance. Together, they led worship that moved nations. Their songs spoke of grace, healing, and restoration, and to the outside world, their marriage looked unbreakable, strong, steady, and deeply anchored in God. But what the public never saw were the quiet storms behind the stage lights. Recently, William Murphy's wife stepped forward and shared her side of the story, and her words changed everything. What she revealed wasn't just about disagreements or distance, it was about the heavy weight of living under the constant spotlight of ministry. Her honesty exposed the side of church leadership few are ever brave enough to talk about, the pressure to appear perfect, the silent battles, and the emotional cost of keeping up appearances when your heart is breaking behind the scenes. In this video, we're going to peel back the layers of their journey, how they met, how their ministry grew into a global platform, and how success began to test the very foundation of their relationship. And as the truth came to light, the story took a turn that left even their closest followers speechless, because this isn't just a story about William Murphy and his wife, it's a story about what happens when faith, fame, and real life collide. It's about the hidden reality that so many church leaders live through, the part no one sees when the lights go out and the microphones are off. So stay with me until the end, because we're about to uncover the revelations, the reactions, and the deeper message behind this story that has everyone talking. Before the headlines, before the controversy, and long before they were seen as gospel royalty, William Murphy and his wife were simply two believers chasing a shared dream, to build a life grounded in faith and purpose. William wasn't always the global voice of worship we know today. Born into a devoted church family, faith wasn't something he discovered, it was something he inherited. His father was a respected pastor, and from an early age, William was surrounded by sermons, choirs, and expectations. Ministry wasn't a choice, it was a calling woven into his very DNA. But even as a young man, one thing set him apart: his voice. It carried a raw mix of power, pain, and purpose that could move hearts and silence crowds. And it was during those early years in ministry that he met her, the woman who would one day stand beside him through fame, pressure, and pain. She wasn't just the pastor's wife type, she was strong, wise, and deeply rooted in faith. Their connection was undeniable. People used to say their love story felt divine, like God himself had written it, a partnership destined to change lives. Many viewed them as the epitome of a kingdom marriage when they were married, a union based on purpose, vision, and faith. Together, Together, they led worship, shared uplifting messages, and started to become well known throughout the gospel community. But their ascent wasn't instantaneous. William's breakthrough came when some of the biggest names in gospel took notice of his strong voice. He led worship alongside Bishop Paul Morton and other artists before joining the entire Gospel Baptist Church fellowship. "Praise is What I Do," one of his songs, became an anthem that was sung in churches all over the world, a song that was inspired by intense personal pain and devotion. Every time he took the stage, his wife was there to encourage him, sometimes in person and other times in silence. As William's ministry became increasingly demanding, she assisted in managing family life. However, their personal time decreased as his schedule became more hectic. Slowly, what had begun as a common dream started to feel like two different lives going on simultaneously. Churchgoers and friends witnessed the public prayers, the hand-holding, and the smiles. They witnessed a man who was passionate about God and a woman who was committed to her husband's mission. They failed to notice the fissures that were developing beneath that flawless exterior, the late evenings spent apart, the emotional weariness, and the quiet arguments that resulted from living under continual surveillance. The expectations increased in tandem with William's ministry's growth. They were more than just husband and wife, they served as spiritual role models. Every action they took was observed, evaluated, and talked about. Furthermore, such pressure does more than merely test your calling. It puts your marriage to the test. Nevertheless, they maintained appearances for years. Numerous young couples looked up to them for guidance because of their inspirational tale of faith and tenacity. However, those closest, tale of faith and tenacity. However, those closest to them started to notice tiny but noticeable changes. The happy flame appeared to wane. Despite William's increased travels, his wife tended to stay at home and take care of the family, church duties, and her own private issues. Nevertheless, in spite of their increasing separation, they both kept giving public speeches about God's grace, how love overcomes all obstacles, and how faith can keep a family together. It was commendable, even motivating. But sometimes what you teach turns into what you're trying to convince yourself of, as one insider put it. And things began to change at that point. The cornerstone of their marriage was being undermined by issues they could no longer ignore, even as the public praised their unity behind closed doors. Years later, William's wife eventually came out, but her narrative wasn't one of triumph or celebrity. This admission revealed the unspoken price of serving in the ministry. But first, let's go back to the point at where things started to alter. The earliest indications where things started to alter. The earliest indications to the public that something wasn't quite right, even though everyone believed it was. While success can be a wonderful gift, it can also be a big weight for many missionary couples, and that burden was starting to weigh heavily on William Murphy and his wife, in ways they never would have thought possible. William's life had entirely changed by the time his song made it to the mainstream gospel charts. He was traveling from state to state, preaching in some of America's most prestigious churches, and leading worship at important conferences. Everywhere, his music were mending hearts. His own heart, however, was slowly shattering at home. It can be blinding to be in the spotlight. When you get home, the cheers that fill auditoriums usually fade into silence. Furthermore, that quiet can be deafening. It appeared to William's wife that the character of Pastor Murphy, the gospel celebrity, was taking precedence over the man she had known in the past, the modest, caring companion who prayed with her and shared dreams with her at night. She initially made an effort to adapt. She recognized that serving in the ministry was more than a job, it was a vocation. She continued to publicly support him, smiled despite fatigue, and went to events when she could. But she started to feel smaller as his name got bigger. People would ask William about his next album, his next sermon, and his next move during interviews. However, hardly anyone inquired about the woman behind him. The very world she helped create lost her visibility, and it hurt a lot to be invisible. She was strong but subtly emotional, according to family sources, the type of woman who gracefully carried her suffering. But eventually, she was unable to ignore the growing emotional gap between them. Tension, stillness, and occasion. Emotional gap between them. Tension, stillness, and occasionally miscommunication took the place of the laughing that formerly characterized their home. William, however, was under a different type of strain. He was expected to be perfect in his faith and in his personal life as a preacher, husband, and father. There was no space for error because the world turned to him for spiritual direction. Even the most devoted hearts can be broken by the pressure. They were adored as a couple and by the church community. However, church life is not always easy. Every appearance, every speech, and every smile had to be flawless. Ministry turned into a show, and connection gradually gave way to performance. Consider this. William's wife was at home by herself, praying that God would keep their marriage together while he led worship in front of hundreds. He was bearing the public burden of his ministry, and she was bearing the emotional burden of their relationship. And year after year, that disparity became more pronounced. A few close pals attempted to step in. They observed the weariness, the faint melancholy in her voice, and the way she sidestepped several inquiries concerning her husband's journey. They didn't want to share their hardships, though, like many ministry families do. They sought to safeguard their reputation, their religion, and the individuals who held them in high regard. In gospel circles, there were murmurs. Although nothing was verified, they had discreet discussions about the stress in their marriage. The Murphys maintained their composure, professionalism, and tact when speaking. However, the church is constantly keeping an eye on things, and even the smallest shift in mood might lead to gossip. One insider claims that William's wife occasionally became noticeably tearful during worship sessions, particularly when songs about brokenness and healing were performed. Others believed she was communicating something more profound, a silent plea for peace in her own household, while others said she was simply being touched by the Spirit. Every lecture on forgiveness had an unknown story behind it. Every post about faith was the result of a battle that is still being resolved. Only God could see the sorrow that lay behind every smile, and yet they went on. That is the power of responsibility, ministry, and image. Sometimes you forget to heal when you're called to lead. However, it wouldn't remain hidden indefinitely. because shortly after, something occurred that brought their personal hardships to the attention of the public, something that caused people to reevaluate all of their preconceived notions about William Murphy and his wife. At this point, the narrative begins to take an unexpected turn. Every partnership has boundaries, and for William Murphy and his spouse, those boundaries first appeared gradually and then suddenly. The barriers they put up to keep their marriage safe started to crumble under the weight of quiet. After years of keeping up a strong front, praying together, and enduring ministry storms, the world continued to witness them praying together, holding hands and grinning. However, many who knew them well felt that something was wrong. Little adjustments were made first. Posts on social media decreased in frequency. Those loving captions vanished. Together, appearances became infrequent. This was noteworthy for a couple with such a strong foundation in public ministry. Fans started posting queries on the internet. His wife is where? Or are they still together? Some even conjectured that she was merely remaining in order to concentrate on her personal ministry or family. Insiders close to the pair, however, disagreed that there was more to the distance than just geography. It was sentimental. William's wife's sincere message, which sent silent shockwaves through the gospel world, marked a turning point. It was not theatrical, nor was it an attack. It was truthful, brutal honesty. She discussed the loneliness that frequently lurks behind the pulpit, the invisible struggles that accompany being married to ministry, and how even those who advocate for healing can occasionally be the ones who suffer the most in her talk. Although she never specifically named William by name, her remarks were clearly intimate. She talked about trying to be strong for a man who is carrying the weight of the world while forgetting that you are also a human, and about falling profoundly in love and seeing that love diminish in the shadow of calling. Those were powerful words. The post quickly began making the rounds on Facebook groups and gospel blogs. Screenshots instantly went viral, and conjecture erupted. She was defended by some followers who praised her bravery for stating her mind. She was chastised by others for allegedly discussing personal issues in public. However, one thing was evident regardless of whether individuals agreed or not. The ideal photo. Either individuals agreed or not, the ideal photo was gone. Whispers quickly became news stories. The wife of William Murphy speaks up. What was actually going on in the Murphy marriage? And when faith and fracture meet, every discussion thread, every gospel outlet, and even Sunday morning talks were a flurry of activity. Being a well-known person, William initially kept silent. Although silence has great power, it can also be misunderstood. His subsequent lectures appeared to have a different tone, more reflective and emotional even if he didn't directly answer. He gave sermons about forgiveness, relationship problems, and the fact that even God's men are still men. According to several close acquaintances, he used those sermons as a public means of processing the sorrow without letting it become a topic of gossip or public spectacle. Instead of using statements, he decided to use scripture to communicate. As this was going on, his wife started getting notes from other women, pastors' wives, gospel singers, and even regular Christians who stated they could identify with her tale. Many claimed that her openness allowed them to acknowledge their own suffering. However, the disagreement increased along with the volume of the conversation. Social media speakers, church leaders, and gospel enthusiasts all started to share their opinions. Some viewed it as a necessary wake-up call, a reminder that ministry couples are not flawless but rather human. For others, it was interpreted as a sign of weakness or even treachery. One question persisted throughout it all. What actually took place? Was it adultery? Was it a lack of emotion? Was it just pressure from the ministry for years? William and his wife did not confirm any of the rumors, thus no one could be certain. They did, however, agree that their marriage had seen severe hardships and that recovery was difficult. People think being married to ministry is glamorous, William's wife later said, but what they don't see is the emptiness, the expectations, and the exhaustion that can follow you home after the lights go out. While ministry can heal others, it can also empty you at times. All communities found resonance in those words. Her narrative abruptly turned into a mirror for the other members of the church leadership who were also going through quiet pain. However, despite the world's sympathy, it was compelled to delve more. People were looking for clarification, specifics, closure, and answers. At that point, the situation changed from a private hardship to a public scandal, because once a marriage becomes a topic of discussion, everyone but the couple involved tends to rewrite the story. According to reports, friends and other pastors urged the Murphys to temporarily leave ministry in order to concentrate on healing and repair. According to some accounts, concentrate on healing and repair. According to some accounts, they both sought counseling around this time, and William was very sorry about how his family life had been dominated by ministry. However, the story had already been dominated by the internet. Podcast conversations, gossip blogs, and YouTube videos all began to frame the tale in their own unique ways. He was accused of carelessness by some. Some alluded to moral failings. However, those assertions were never substantiated by any reliable evidence. However, it's difficult to shake the shadow cast by the internet after you've been labeled, and one reality stood out among all the chaos. This has nothing to do with scandal, it had to do with humanity. It told the story of two people who loved God and one other, but who became confused between pressure and purpose. Speaking out wasn't an act of retaliation for William's wife. It was freedom. Her admission proved a turning point for William, a reminder to focus on oneself rather than the outside world. It was her way of saying, I matter too, my pain matters, my voice matters, because God occasionally transforms via brokenness. This is where it becomes even more unexpected though. The events that followed not only altered their relationship, but also the church's overall perspective on ministry marriages, and perhaps the most surprising aspect of all is what comes next. William Murphy's wife remained silent for years, faithful, elegant, and taciturn. Even if it meant shielding them from her own truth, she defended her faith, her husband, and her home. However, she eventually came to the conclusion that silence was no longer a strength. Suffocation was the result. And the gospel community as a whole would be affected by what she said next. She started her confession in a true sit-down chat that was broadcast online, speaking candidly, honestly, and without resentment, rather than in a tabloid interview or a widely circulated podcast. In every syllable, you could sense her anguish, yet you could also sense her calm. I prayed for years that we would find balance, and that ministry wouldn't always come before marriage. But slowly, I realized that I was losing myself while trying to save something that needed both of us to fight for it, she said. I loved him with everything I had, but love alone doesn't heal what you refuse to face. She talked about how being a pastor's wife meant living under constant expectation, expected to smile through pain, to show strength even when her heart was breaking. Her words struck a chord with countless people, and they were no longer just about William, they were about the silent suffering of women who stand by great men but frequently lose their own voice in the process. People assume that being married to a pastor entails leading a perfect life, she remarked, but perfection is a performance and I got tired of performing. Her statement alone sparked thousands of online replies, and within hours, footage of her speech were making the rounds on Facebook groups, TikTok, Instagram, and gospel blogs, and people started arguing. Was she exposing the church system, calling out her husband, or just speaking her truth as a woman who had been silent for too long? Her confession was all the more potent because she never once treated William disrespectfully, never laid blame on him directly, and never divulged personal information. Instead, she humanized him. He is a good man, a godly man, she remarked. However, she was attempting to heal herself, not to destroy him, and her statement, but even good men can get lost in good work, broke people's hearts because it was honest, mature, and real. She described how ministry had become the third partner in their marriage, always present, always demanding, and always between them. When she said, when the whole world is pulling on your husband, you start to wonder if there's anything left for you. People realized that this was not just the Murphy story, but the story of every couple who has ever had to share their purpose with each other. Responses poured in after the interview aired. While some church leaders condemned her honesty, arguing that she should have handled it secretly, many praised her bravery. Pastors and spouses from all over the nation came out with similar testimony, discussing the emotional toll of being the silent strength behind a loud calling. The following week saw William Murphy break his silence not through confrontation, but through a sermon when he stood on stage with his eyes heavy and his voice trembling, telling his congregation, "Even the strongest among us can lose sight of what matters most." One comment under the interview summed it up perfectly. Sometimes telling your truth isn't betrayal, it's deliverance. Without mentioning the widely shared confession, William talked about humility, forgiveness, and restoration. You can preach about love every Sunday, but if you don't live it at home, you're just making noise, he said. Ministry means nothing if it costs you, your family. The church fell silent. Some people said they could feel the conviction in the room, while others said it was the most vulnerable they'd ever seen him. This wasn't a sermon, it was a disguised confession, and those who had followed his journey for years understood exactly what he meant. From that point on, it seemed as though William and his wife were entering a new era, one that was less concerned with appearance and more concerned with the truth. They started attending events separately, but there was no hostility or open conflict. It was evident that they were on a challenging but necessary path to recovery. According to family sources, they started going to counseling separately, not to immediately fix their marriage, but to rediscover who they were as individuals, because sometimes repairing a relationship requires repairing the individuals within it. Even more potent is the fact that her candor strengthened rather than destroyed his ministry. In the months that followed, William's music started to change. His more recent songs had a tone of vulnerability, introspection, and broken worship. His audience could sense the change. This was no longer the sound of a man leading the crowd. One of his close friends commented, "Pain changes your praise." It was the cry of a guy who was learning to heal. The whole experience was encapsulated in the quote, "You can't sing about breakthrough until you've been broken." William Murphy's wife had spoken her truth, not to demolish but to liberate them both from the delusion of perfection. Because so much of life in the gospel industry is filtered through the lens of holiness and image, her confession reminded people that even the faithful fall, even the anointed bleed, and even the strongest love stories occasionally break under pressure. By doing this, she gave the world something uncommon: honesty from within the walls of faith.